Hi, I'm Tamara Robertson. Did you know that the teenage brain is more vulnerable to addiction than in adults? Dr. Nora Volkow, a pioneer in the study of addiction, has spent over 3 decades studying how drugs change the brain. In this video, she explains how addiction works and why young brains are at a higher risk. Check it out.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I have this huge light, so I cannot see your faces, which is really unfortunate, because if you fall asleep, I will know that what I'm saying is boring you to death. But it is actually, what I'm going to be speaking to you is, I think, one of the most challenging questions that we all have, and which is what happens to our brain when we lose control of our actions. And this is something that, of course, we all give granted for. If I make a decision that I'm going to do something, I assume that I have free will and I'll be able to do it. Of course, if we're all honest with ourselves, we've all been, I certainly have been in situations where you say, I'm going to do this, and then, like I said, I'm not going to eat that chocolate, and then whatever happens, I'm eating the chocolate. So the notion of being able to control our desires, our motivations, our actions, our thoughts, is something that most of the time we're in control with. But when we consistently lose control over this capacity to control these phenomena, then that's what we call addiction. And people that are addicted to drugs are taking the drugs not because they want to take them, but because they no longer can stop it. For many, many years, I'm a physician. I've been treating people that are addicted, and never once have I met a person that said, I wanted to become addicted. I started taking drugs because I didn't know. My friends were doing it. And then it was a point where I could not go back, but that wasn't a choice. Because I was interested on what makes us uniquely human, what makes us different from one another, immediately I was attracted to the brain, because who we are is really a function of the unique characteristics of our brain. And as I was in medical school, there was a technology that was emerging, brain imaging, that allows us for the first time to look inside the human brain. In the past, you had to wait until someone died, and then you do an analysis of the brain, or you infer information from studies in animals, which are much less complex than us. So I was very, very lucky to actually be doing my medical school when these imaging technologies were evolving. So as soon as I finished medical school, I said I want to do a training. And I did training in psychiatry at New York University, specifically because this university had access to these imaging technologies. And in particular, at that time, that type of technology that first emerged was one that's called positron emission tomography, or PET for easier to remember. And this is me doing a study actually on a patient that was a drug-addicted individual. Because when I started to say, what can I do with these imaging technologies? And studying psychiatry, you may imagine, my God, this is incredible. I mean, you can see, why is it someone that is hallucinating? Why is it someone, what happens in the brain when someone is depressed and no longer wants to live? And also what happens in the brain of someone that has lost control over their actions, and they keep on taking drugs even though they say they don't want to take them, and even though it comes at really very catastrophic consequences to their life. So this is where it starts in terms of the science. We have to realize that addiction is a product of exposure to drugs, as we call it, drug addiction. But as you may think, that we also have come to realize that we also become addicted to certain behaviors. So we can be addicted not just to drugs, we can be addicted to food, we can be addicted to gambling, we can be addicted to actually power. And so the issue is we recognize drug addiction because it's probably the way that we can become addicted that is faster to get at because of the characteristics of drugs. So drugs are chemicals that can modify the function of the brain, triggering the process of addiction, which characterizes the loss of control. But not everybody that gets exposed to drugs becomes addicted, and this is one of the most interesting questions scientifically. Why? Why is it that I can take alcohol and not become an alcoholic versus my brother or my sister can? And we now know that there are multiple factors that are involved in that answer, whether someone becomes addicted or not. One of them is your biology and genetics. Genetics, if you have the gene risk for addiction, you're much more likely to become addicted than if you don't. So my mother's brother was an alcoholic, and her father was an alcoholic. And therefore, I can presume that I may have those genes that make me more vulnerable. And as a result of that, I tend to be very careful when drinking alcohol. There are other factors in biology that determines our vulnerability, and that one of the most important one is your age. So if you are a teenager, like all of you are, or you are in young adulthood transitioning into your early 20s, that is a period where your brain is particularly plastic. And what does it mean it's plastic? That it actually changes physically as a function of the environment. And this is a wonderful thing of our brain, because it allows us to optimize the structure and architecture to be able to actually survive in the environments that we're thrown at. So this is how we've evolved. But this unique capacity is much more advanced when we're children and adolescents, so we can change much faster, and those changes last longer. And that's why we can learn much faster when we are teenagers, and what we learn will remain with us much longer than if we learn it later in adulthood. The counter side is when you take a drug that actually modifies these plastic changes, your brain will physically change much faster, and therefore you are at higher risk of addiction. So why do drugs produce addiction? We've known that all of the drugs produce addiction because they have the capacity to increase a chemical by the name of dopamine in your brains. And dopamine is a chemical that biology created after years and years, millions of years of evolution, to signal reward, to signal that something is important, salient. And so it's a chemical that motivates our actions for movements. It's also a chemical that actually leads you to motivation to do things that otherwise you wouldn't, like risk-taking. It creates a sense of well-being, and it's fundamental in the process of addiction. As I say, all of the drugs increase dopamine, and we've been able to see that in animal experiments. You place a cannula inside the brain of an animal and directly target it to the reward centers. And then you can measure how drugs increase dopamine, as you see there for amphetamine. But the brain and evolution did not create this system of dopamine and the reward for us to take drugs. It created is to motivate us to do behaviors that are indispensable for survival of the individual and the species. So it's no surprise that food, which we need in order to survive as organisms, as well as sex, which we need in order to survive for the species, are associated with very pleasurable responses. And all of these behaviors are linked with very sharp increases in dopamine in reward centers. And it's these increases that actually ultimately drive our motivation to do those behaviors. And what happens is drugs do exactly the same thing by a chemical, I would like to call it randomness of nature. There are not many drugs out there in nature, fortunately, that can increase dopamine, but those that do actually have the capacity to produce addiction. An item that is important to recognize is that drugs increase dopamine much more than any of the natural rewards, and that characteristic is ultimately what results in the changes in the brain that will lead to the loss of control. Using imaging, we can actually monitor those changes that are producing drugs in dopamine, not just when you're high, but also very importantly, after you've taken it repeatedly and you become addicted, you can actually ask the question, what happens to the dopamine system when you constantly bombarded with drugs? We know by biology that when you constantly stimulate any one system, whether it's your heart, your muscles, or your brain, you start to create adaptation process to compensate. So in the dopamine system, what is that? For example, we can look at different elements that are signaling dopamine. So dopamine is liberated when you take a drug, and it sends the message by binding to receptors, which are just proteins. And when dopamine binds to these specific dopamine receptors, it activates reward centers, and that triggers that whole cascade. And what we've seen across many, many years of almost 3 decades of imaging studies is that whether you're a cocaine abuser, methamphetamine abuser, alcoholic, heroin, nicotine abuser, across all of these addictions, people that are addicted have a reduction in the levels of dopamine receptors in the brain. And you see that in the 2 columns, you have into your left a normal control, and into your right, a person that's addicted to the drug delineated there. And you can see that the central areas of the brain where you have the reward centers, there's much lower concentration of receptors in people that are addicted to drugs consistently. Now, one of the questions is, well, what is that importance? And a very simple diagram is here. you need these receptors for dopamine when it's liberated to signal reward. And so when you have those receptors going down when you are addicted, actually you can liberate dopamine, but that reward signal is going to be very attenuated. And this is something that we have learned, contrary to what we believe, that people who are addicted, in fact, after repeated use of the drug, the reward centers of the brain become dysfunctional. So they are much less sensitive. In other words, you require a much more intense signaling of dopamine in order to produce the same effect. So in other words, if you're getting high now to feel good, you are mortgaging yourself because you will have to pay in the future for being much less sensitive to natural rewards. And this explains why when people become addicted, whether it is alcohol or cocaine or marijuana, whichever of the drugs, they actually, when they are not intoxicated, when they are not high, they start to lose the interest and the excitement for everyday things in their lives, whether these things are food, whether these things are going and reading a book or playing sports. All of the things that we feel rewarding that excites us starts to pale. They lose that capacity to excite us and drive us. And as a result of that, the person that is addicted basically is left with very poor options to activate these reward systems. And let me tell you, our brain needs those reward centers to be activated. In a way, it's a little bit like when you're thirsty. You're thirsty, we have those thirst sensation, because it's a way that we are motivated to do things that will actually make us drink water and create an homeostatic physiology that is good for us. When we are bored because that's the way that the brain sends a signal. You better do something that excites you and activates you and engages you. And when you become addicted, that excitement does not occur. And what can get you and kick you out of that state of apathy and disinterest is taking the drug. So it becomes a vicious cycle that drives the intake of the drug and perpetuates that decreased sensitivity of these reward centers. So an important question has always been, and again, I was struck, as a researcher, I was struck, that something as simple as one protein, D2 receptors, being low in people that are addicted, can make them vulnerable to addiction? How can such a complex behavior be capitulated by one protein? And so I was curious to see if we increase those receptors, can we revert? Can we bring back people to controlling their drug intake and be in command? So we don't know how to increase dopamine D2 receptors in the human brain, and that would be a fantastic treatment for addiction. We don't know how to do that. But in science now, what we do is we take information that we find from human studies and then interrogate it in animals. Just as in the past, most of the science was being done, but we found in animals, then we interrogated in humans. Now the dialogue in science is both ways. So we have this finding of low receptors in people that are addicted. What about if we modify those receptors in animals that are addicted? And you can make animals addicted to drugs. Addiction is not an imperative of the human brain. You actually can make flies addicted, you can make rats addicted, mice addicted, monkeys addicted, dogs addicted. All of our brains are hardwired for rewards, and in all of these brains, drugs produce changes that trigger this compulsive pattern of administration and loss of control. So in these animals, in this case, we've worked with rats, we make them addicted to alcohol and cocaine, and we increase the levels of dopamine D2 receptors with gene therapy. We inject them, and in animals you can do that. You can inject directly into the brain the gene using a virus as the syringe to insert into the cells. And when you do that, you increase dopamine receptors. As of now, all of the models increase the receptors just for a short period of time, and you see it over there. For 4 days, 50% increases in dopamine D2 receptors when you inject the gene, but by then 10, it's back to normal. When you do that and increase the levels of dopamine D2 receptors in animals that are addicted, what do you see? You see a dramatic reduction in the consumption of drugs, whether it's alcohol or cocaine. Somehow, increasing the levels of dopamine D2 receptor, presumably by increasing the sensitivity of your brain to dopamine and signaling of reward, is like you have satiety, you have enough. You don't need to engage in those patterns of compulsive administration. So one of the questions all along is if you have these decreases in dopamine D2 receptors that are low, And can you counteract it? Can you counteract it with your cognitive control, with your free will? So I say, okay, I don't have sufficient stimulation of dopamine, and I want more. I move because I'm still hungry for that drug. But I say to my brain, okay, my cortex, my frontal cortex, no, Nora, don't do it. You should not. If you take that drug tomorrow, they are testing your urine, you're positive, you end back in jail. So I control myself. Can I control it? And the problem is that dopamine also modulates the frontal cortical areas of the brain. And for these frontal cortical areas of the brain that are involved with cognitive control, with self-regulation, with self-control, the decreases in dopamine actually lead to inactivation of these areas, decrease in function of the areas that allows you to regulate and self-control. So what you have in the whole process is you have a dysregulation of reward centers that are not sensitive by dopamine decreases, and the decreases in dopamine are also influencing the frontal cortex and thus dysregulating the capacity of the frontal cortex to exert control over these very strong urges and desires. So in all of these, why is environment important? Why are there certain environments, particularly socially stressful environments, that make you more vulnerable? And what we've done is actually, these are studies in non-human primates, and these are studies done at Wake Forest. It's an elegant study done in monkeys. And in monkeys also, like us, we are social creatures. And one of the most stressful things that you can do to a social creature is actually isolate them. And that's why prison, when you're in prison and they want to punish you, you are isolating that individual. And that's probably one of the most stressful things that you can do. And that's also probably one of the most harmful things that you can do vis-a-vis the ability of that person to lose control and become vulnerable to drug taking. And what this study just shows is that when you're in an individually housed, as these animals were since they were born, they have very low levels of dopamine receptors in the brain because it's very, very stressful. And stress decreases the levels of dopamine D2 receptors in your brain. Then those animals are brought into a social environment, and those animals that become dominant in a group house environment increase the levels of dopamine D2 receptors in their brains. Whereas those that are subordinate and continue to have the stressors of the other abusing them and bullying them continue to have low levels of dopamine D2 receptors. And long and behold, it is those animals that are subordinate continue to have low levels of dopamine D2 receptors that when exposed to an environment where they can administer cocaine, do so. In contrast, individuals that are in this dominant environment where there are not many social stressors, those animals, basically, if they consume cocaine, they consume very, very little quantities, and most of the time they do not. Why? Their system is very sensitive to dopamine stimulation by other means. So where is it based on all of these studies in our understanding of addiction? Well, I like to speak of addiction as a disease that has unbalanced our brain. We have, all of us on everyday life, exposed to situations where we want to do something and we think about it and say, is it right for me to do, or I better not do it because it may have negative consequences. Or I better not do it because if I abstain myself from this, maybe 1 month later I'll have much more reward. And what happens in addiction is that desire itself that comes from the limbic brain areas, the brain areas involved with reward and emotions, is actually being changed by the repeated administration of drugs. So it's much less sensitive to natural rewards, but it's hypersensitized to anything that relates to drugs, including environments where you've taken the drug. So even though it's not the drug itself, just being in that environment will activate the system. On the other hand, the frontal cortical areas of our brain that allows us to make decisions and carry them through and control our desires and emotions have also been weakened by the repeated administrations of the drug. And it is this unbalance with very, very strong desires and drives for the drug and the very poor control that leads to the compulsive pattern of drug self-administration, despite the fact that most individuals, when you ask them that they are addicted, and I ask them, why do you take the drug? Because I'm a very curious person. And they say, Doc, you know, many have actually answered it this way. Doc, I don't even know why I do it. The drug is no longer rewarding, but I just cannot stop it. And in that sense, they become literally slaves to the drug itself. And that's what ultimately drug does to our brain when you become addicted. And we don't know how or whether we will have that transition when we start taking drugs and experimenting. But we do know that the younger you start taking drugs, the greater the risks. And we also do know that the consequences from addiction are quite devastating to the person and to the individual. Thanks very much.